The KKK, infamous for its history of racial hatred and terror, is a name that sends shivers down the spine. Today we are going to see what happens to those who spread hate and are sentenced to life behind bars. It's a no-nonsense look at justice, transformation, and human nature that'll hit home for everyone. No frills, just the raw truth waiting to grab your attention. Let's jump in. D.C. Stevenson, David Curtis. Steve Stevenson was a significant figure in the Ku Klux Klan during the early 20th century. In 1923, he became the leader of the KKK in Indiana, and his role also involved overseeing KKK recruitment in 7 other states. This elevated him to a prominent position within the national KKK organization. Stevenson's influence reached beyond the state of Indiana, thanks to his close connections with various Indiana politicians, especially Governor Edward L. Jackson. D.C. Stevenson was charged with the rape and kidnapping of Madge Oberholzer, with whom he had a relationship. Stevenson forcefully abducted her, subjected her to sexual assault, and forcibly took her to a hotel. He was charged with second-degree murder, as Madge Oberholzer ultimately died from poisoning with mercury bichloride, which she had ingested in a suicide attempt following the traumatic ordeal. His life sentence sent shockwaves through the state of Indiana. At the height of his power, he had boasted about being the law in Indiana, but now he found himself on the other side of it, facing grave charges. The reactions to Stevenson's sentencing were mixed. Governor Ed Jackson, who had benefited from Stevenson's political maneuvering, publicly denounced him. The Indiana Courier, which was a pro-Klan publication that had once praised Stevenson's influence, published a scathing article calling him an enemy of the order and demanding that he be held accountable for his crimes. Marion County prosecutor William Remy relentlessly pursued the case against Stevenson and was one of those people whom Stevenson could not control. His efforts resulted in a verdict that sent a clear message that even the most powerful individuals would be held accountable for their actions. At the end of the trial, William Remy decried Stevenson as a destroyer of virtue and womanhood. Madge's family, who had endured unimaginable pain, were relieved that Stevenson had been brought to justice. Moreover, the people of Indiana, who had once largely supported the Klan, were left reeling from the revelations of Stevenson's crimes. Many were appalled by the brutal details of the case and hoped that it would mark the end of the Klan's influence in the state. Stevenson's actions and the subsequent exposure of the Klan's influence in politics hastened the organization's decline in the late 1920s. The Klan, which had once boasted millions of members, found itself rapidly losing credibility and membership. As the years passed, Stevenson faced multiple brushes with the law, including charges of attempted sexual assault in 1961. He died in 1966 in Jonesboro, Tennessee, leaving behind a legacy of infamy and disgrace. Travis McMichael. The case of Travis McMichael revolves around the tragic death of Ahmaud Arbery, a 25-year-old black man who was shot and killed while jogging through a Georgia neighborhood in February 2020. Arbery's killing garnered widespread attention as it raised questions about racial bias, vigilantism, and the pursuit of justice. Travis McMichael, along with his father Gregory McMichael and neighbor William Roddy Bryan, confronted Ahmaud Arbery while he was running. Travis, armed with a shotgun, fatally shot Arbery during the encounter. The men claimed they were conducting a citizen's arrest and acted in self-defense. However, the prosecution argued that the McMichaels and Bryan pursued Arbery due to racial bias, which turned the tragic incident into a hate crime. In the federal hate crimes trial held in February 2022, Travis McMichael and his co-defendants were found guilty on various charges, including murder, attempted kidnapping, and the use of a firearm to commit a crime. During an extraordinary courtroom moment, the judge paused his address and observed a full minute of silence. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Walmsley admitted to being haunted by the immense fear that must have gripped Arbery during those harrowing moments. Travis McMichael faced a life sentence plus an additional 20 years in federal prison. He chose not to address the court directly during his sentencing, which left many observers speculating about his feelings and thoughts. Travis's attorney, Amy Lee Copeland, expressed concerns about his safety in state prison due to perceived threats and had requested that he serve his sentence in federal prison. However, the judge ruled that Travis would serve his sentence in state prison rather than federal prison. This decision had a profound impact on Travis McMichael's future, as it marked the beginning of his time behind bars. His father, Gregory McMichael, who was sentenced to life plus an additional 7 years, addressed the court during his sentencing. Gregory expressed remorse and sorrow for the incident, emphasizing that there was no malice in his or his son's heart that day. This was a heartfelt response to the gravity of the situation. William Roddy Bryan, sentenced to 35 years in prison, also expressed remorse and offered an apology apology to Ahmaud Arbery's family during his sentencing. He acknowledged that he never intended harm and that he would not have played any role in the events if he had known the tragic outcome. Travis's decision not to speak during the sentencing left many wondering about his inner thoughts and feelings regarding the life sentence he was facing. The sentences for the defendants marked the end of a chapter in a painful journey for Ahmaud Arbery's family and the broader community, and the case raised important questions about justice and accountability in the criminal justice system. Edgar Ray Killan. Edgar Ray Killan was a former Ku Klux Klan leader who became infamous for his role in the 1964 Mississippi burning case, in which he was implicated in the murders of civil rights activists James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman. These three young activists were investigating the burning of a black church in Philadelphia, Mississippi, during the Freedom Summer of 1964. The shocking murders sent shockwaves across the nation, ultimately contributing to the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and were later depicted in the film Mississippi Burning. In 2005, after 41 years, Killan was convicted of 3 counts of manslaughter by a Neshoba County jury. At the time of his conviction, he was 80 years old. Killan was the only individual ever brought to state murder charges in connection with the Mississippi burning case. During his trial, witnesses testified that he had orchestrated the ambush of Schwerner, Chaney, and Goodman. Killan had served as a Klan organizer in Neshoba County, helping establish local Klan groups. Reactions to Killan's conviction were mixed, reflecting the complex and divided history of the Deep South. Civil rights activists, family members of the victims, and supporters expressed relief and satisfaction that Killan was finally held accountable for his actions. Outside the courthouse, people were cheering. Inside, older black men who had grown up in a time of segregation but lived to see change were overwhelmed with emotion. Some of them covered their faces and cried. Meanwhile, Killan, seated in his wheelchair, looked angry as he left the courthouse, even lashing out at a camera, while Killan remained defiant and continued to maintain his innocence, claiming he was a political prisoner rather than a criminal. He spoke of his connections with political figures and the late Senator James O. Eastland during interviews, suggesting that he had influential acquaintances who might support him. Killan also claimed that fellow inmates at Mississippi State Penitentiary were aware of his identity, but he gave no indication of how they responded to his presence. Killan filed a lawsuit against the FBI, alleging that the government used illicit tactics during the investigation. However, his lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. Edgar Ray Killan's life sentence brought a mix of reactions from those who remembered the deep-seated racial tensions and violence of the civil rights era. While some saw it as a long overdue step towards justice, others clung to a legacy of denial and resistance. He died on January 11, 2018, at the Mississippi State Penitentiary in Parchman, Mississippi, 6 days before his 93rd birthday. Russell Cordier. Russell Orlando Cordier, a white supremacist who intentionally ran over and killed 19-year-old Larnell Bruce Jr., a young African-American man, with his car, was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 28 years before the possibility of parole. The crime was racially motivated, and the sentence was the culmination of a trial in which Cordier was found guilty of murder, felony hit and run, and second-degree intimidation, classified as a hate crime in Oregon. The incident occurred in August 2016 outside a 7-Eleven store in the Portland suburb of Gresham, Oregon. Cordier and Bruce got into a physical altercation, and during the fight, Cordier was seen making racial slurs. Bruce, holding a machete, attempted to defend himself. However, as the situation escalated, Cordier got into his car, a red Jeep, and pursued Bruce, who was attempting to flee. Surveillance video captured Bruce desperately trying to evade Cordier and the Jeep. The tragic event led to a hit-and-run incident, and Bruce was found with life-threatening injuries on a nearby sidewalk after being run over by the Jeep. He succumbed to his injuries after being rushed to the hospital. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence that this act of violence was driven by Cordier's racist beliefs and membership in the European kindred white supremacist prison gang. This landmark decision marked Oregon's first hate crime murder conviction in 3 decades. Russell Cordier's sentencing hearing was an emotional occasion, with strong statements from the victims' family members. Christina Mines, Bruce's biological mother, expressed her profound grief, saying, "You allowed the devil to misguide you and take the life of such a beautiful young spirit." Cordier's reaction to his life sentence was mixed with visible emotion. He teared up during the hearing while listening to Bruce's family members speak about their loss. However, this display of emotion from him didn't sway Bruce's stepmother, Natasha Bruce, who believed Cordier's tears were insincere. She stated that someone who could commit such a heinous act showed no empathy or remorse. The emotional and heated atmosphere surrounding the case was palpable, with Bruce's family and friends releasing green helium balloons after the hearing to symbolize the organs that Bruce donated. Colleen Hunt, who was present in the passenger seat of the Jeep during the incident and encouraged Cordier Cordier's actions, was also sentenced to 10 years in prison for her involvement. She had pleaded guilty to manslaughter and aided and abetted Cordier in Bruce's murder. The sentencing brought some relief to the victim's family, as they now know that Cordier will remain incarcerated for decades. While the pain of their loss remains, they hope this verdict sends a strong message against hate crimes and white supremacy. Jeremy Christian, a man convicted of hate crimes and the murders of 2 individuals on a commuter train in Oregon, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His crimes, committed based on unreasonable racial and religious biases, left a lasting impact on the victims and their families. Christian's reactions during the trial and upon receiving his life sentence were marked by anger, a lack of remorse, and a complete absence of accountability for his actions. Christian's crimes occurred in 2017 when he launched into a hate-filled tirade on a Portland Max train, targeting 2 black teenage girls, one of whom was wearing a hijab. Passengers on the train tried to intervene, with Micah Fletcher, one of the victims, telling Christian to shut up and leave the girls alone. This confrontation escalated quickly, leading to a violent and fatal knife attack by Christian. Ricky Best and Taliesin Namkai Mechi lost their lives, while Fletcher survived with a prominent scar on his throat. During the trial, Christian displayed a complete lack of remorse and an alarming level of defiance. He refused to take responsibility for his actions and continued to spew hate even during court proceedings. During the trial, he admitted that while he regrets the loss of 2 lives, he stands by the actions that ultimately caused their deaths. In a chilling attempt to rationalize his behavior, he asserted that what transpired on the Max train was not driven by hatred, but rather he intended to provoke a reaction from those he referred to as liberals. According to him, his actions were geared not towards murder, but rather to assert his right to free speech. This statement by Christian left many shocked and appalled, as it displayed his unapologetic stance and the alarming absence of empathy for the victims and their families. His behavior also included shouting and making derogatory comments to victims and witnesses.
I should have killed you. I should have killed you. Everybody knows you're a liar. Everybody knows you're a liar.
Christian's actions during the trial led to him being removed from the courtroom. When the time came for Christian to make a statement before his sentencing, he shockingly placed the blame on his surviving victim, Micah Fletcher, and showed no regret for his role in the deaths of Best and Namkai Mechi. He declared that he regretted the deaths, but not his actions leading up to them, seemingly failing to acknowledge the irony of his contradictory statement. Demetria Hester, a victim who had experienced Christian's menacing on the night before the murders, expressed her disappointment in the court's handling of the case. Christian's reaction to the life sentence handed down by the judge was a mix of emotional displays, including teary eyes and anger. However, he continued to deny responsibility and rationalized his actions, further emphasizing his inability to comprehend the gravity of his crimes. The judge delivered a powerful message, stating that Christian had confused the freedom of speech with inflicting his will on others, making it clear that his actions were inexcusable. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Christian maintained his distorted views and failed to display any semblance of remorse, leaving the victims' families and the court with a chilling reminder of the hate that persists in society. Shawn Barry. On a fateful night in Jasper, Texas, Barry, along with 2 other white men, Lawrence Brewer and John King, perpetrated one of the most abhorrent hate crimes in American history. James Byrd Jr., a well-liked and respected African-American man, had accepted a ride from Barry, whom he knew from around town. However, this seemingly innocent act turned into a gruesome tragedy when Barry, Brewer, and King embarked on a campaign of violence and cruelty against Byrd. They beat him, urinated on him, and ultimately chained him by the ankles to the back of their pickup truck. Then Barry drove while Brewer and King dragged Byrd down a deserted rural road for 3 miles, resulting in Byrd's gruesome death. Following their arrest, Barry, Brewer, and King were tried and convicted for the brutal murder of James Byrd Jr. Barry's role in the crime was significant. Even though he later claimed to have tried to stop the attack, it was found that minimal evidence supported his claim. He was held equally responsible for the vicious crime. In the wake of the trial and sentencing, the reactions to Shawn Barry's life sentence varied. While Barry's attorneys had presented witnesses who attested that he was not a racist, the jury found him guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. Unlike his co-conspirators, Barry did show some degree of remorse for his actions, which may have influenced his sentence. Barry emphasized his innocence and said, "I am very sorry for what happened to Mr. Byrd, and I've said that from day one. I wanted to speak to the Byrd family personally, but I couldn't." As of 2020, Barry resided in protective custody at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice's Ramsey Unit, where he spent 23 hours a day in an 8 by 6 foot cell, with just 1 hour for exercise. Shawn Shawn Barry's reactions to his life sentence were not extensively documented. However, it's important to recognize that the consequences of his actions left a lasting scar on the community and the nation. This case not only highlighted the prevalence of white supremacist prison gangs, but also brought attention to the urgent need for hate crime legislation in Texas, and eventually influenced federal II legislation like the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. Reactions to the case extended beyond the courtroom, prompting a national conversation about racial hatred and violence in the United States. Kathy Answorth. Kathy Answorth's involvement in the Ku Klux Klan and her participation in violent acts during the Civil Rights era sent shockwaves through the nation. Her actions, along with her accomplice Thomas Terrence, culminated in a horrifying attack on the congregation Beth Israel in 1968, underscoring the racial tensions of the time. In the lead-up to her heinous crime, Kathy Answorth, along with Terrence, was deeply embedded in the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan and other related Klan groups. She had been influenced by far-right propaganda and hate materials, often sourced from various extremist organizations across the United States. Answorth's indoctrination into the world of hate and racism was a stark contrast to her seemingly ordinary life. Their most notorious act was the bombing of the congregation Beth Israel, which took place on May 28, 1968. This shocking act of violence against a Jewish congregation, fueled by deep-seated prejudice and hatred, sent ripples of fear and outrage across the country. Kathy Answorth and Thomas Terrence planned to further their reign of terror by targeting Meyer Davidson, a prominent figure in the Mississippi Jewish community. Early on the morning of June 30, 1968, they set out to plant a bomb near his house, with Answorth waiting in the car while Terrence attempted to carry out the deadly act. The law enforcement, forewarned by Klan informants, staged an ambush to apprehend the pair. In the ensuing confrontation, Kathy Answorth was fatally shot in the neck, leading to her immediate death. A loaded pistol and her KKK membership card were discovered in her purse. While searching her home, authorities found right-wing literature from extremist groups, further highlighting the depth of her radicalization. The reactions to Kathy Answorth's crimes and her subsequent death were mixed and reflective of the turbulent times. While some individuals within the extremist circles may have celebrated her as a martyr, the broader public, including political and law enforcement authorities, condemned her actions and those of her accomplice. While her actions may have inspired a twisted form of loyalty among some extremists, they also contributed to the resolve. Samuel Bowers. Samuel Bowers was the former imperial wizard of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, who had long eluded justice for his role in the 1962 murder of civil rights worker Vernon Dahmer Sr. Dahmer, a prominent civil rights leader, had been targeted for his efforts to help African Americans register to vote. Bowers ordered the brutal firebombing attack on Dahmer's home, resulting in his death. For 3 decades, Bowers faced multiple trials, all of which ended in deadlocked juries, as he had often been tried by all-white panels. In August, after years of legal battles and new witnesses coming forward, Samuel Bowers was finally sentenced to life in prison for his role in the murder of Vernon Dahmer Sr. This landmark verdict was a momentous occasion for those who had waited for justice for over 30 years. The previous all-white juries had failed to deliver a conviction, but this time, the jury was composed of individuals from diverse racial backgrounds, including 5 black jurors, 1 Asian juror, and 6 white jurors. The sentencing of Samuel Bowers marked a significant victory for civil rights advocates and those who had tirelessly worked to see justice served in the case. It was a moment of closure for the family of Vernon Dahmer Sr., especially for his widow, Ellie Dahmer, who had continued her husband's legacy by working as an election official in Mississippi. For her, this verdict represented a long-awaited moment of triumph. Samuel Bowers, who had already served 6 years in prison for the 1964 murders of 3 civil rights workers, now faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars. While the sentencing carried the possibility of parole after 10 years, it was a significant blow to the former Klan leader. His age, 73 at the time, meant that the life sentence would likely equate to life in prison. In the wake of his sentencing, there was no public statement or reaction from Samuel Bowers himself, at least none that made it to the forefront of the media. The man who had once been a prominent figure in white supremacist and Klan circles had been silent. The weight of his life sentence and the finality of his fate appeared to have left him without words. While Samuel Bowers remained silent, there was undoubtedly a mix of emotions within his circle and among his followers. The life sentence represented the end of an era for the once powerful Klan leader. It was a stark contrast to the bold and defiant rhetoric he had once spewed during the height of his influence. Bowers had now become a symbol of the changing times and the gradual shift towards justice in the civil rights era. In the larger context of American history, the sentencing of Samuel Bowers was another step toward confronting the legacy of racial violence and extremism, acknowledging the wrongs of the past and providing closure for the victims and their families. Byron Beckwith. Byron Beckwith's life sentence for the murder of civil rights leader Medgar Evers marked a pivotal moment in a long and tumultuous legal journey. The case, which had initially seen 2 trials in 1964 with hung juries, was revived in 1994 with new evidence that led to Beckwith's conviction. This event drew reactions from various quarters, including Beckwith himself and those close to him. Beckwith's involvement in the murder of Medgar Evers was a dark stain on American history. In 1963, at the age of 42, he assassinated Evers, a prominent civil rights leader, by shooting him in the back outside his own home in Jackson, Mississippi. The crime was a cowardly act of racial hatred, leaving Evers' wife, Merle, and their 3 young children traumatized. The legal process that followed the murder was contentious and marked by racial tensions. Beckwith, a white supremacist and member of the Ku Klux Klan, faced 2 trials in 1964, both ending in hung juries. His trials were conducted by all-white male Mississippi juries, reflecting the racial disparities and injustices of the time. The reactions to these trials were mixed. Some white supremacists, supporters of Beckwith, celebrated the hung juries as a sign of resistance against the civil rights movement. On the other hand, those seeking justice for Medgar Evers, particularly the Evers family and civil rights activists, were deeply disappointed. The state's failure to convict Beckwith in 1964 only fueled the determination of those who believed that justice must be served. Years later, in 1994, the case took a dramatic turn. Merle Evers, now a prominent civil rights leader in her own right, refused to give up on her husband's case. New evidence emerged, revealing that jurors in the original trials had been illegally screened, and the case was reopened. Beckwith, who had been living in Tennessee, was brought back to Mississippi for a 3rd trial. Beckwith's reaction to this development was one of resistance. He attempted to have the case dismissed on the grounds of a violation of his rights to a speedy trial, due process, and protection from double jeopardy. This legal maneuvering demonstrated his unwillingness to accept responsibility for his heinous crime. During the 1994 trial, Beckwith's reactions were closely observed. The presentation of new evidence, including a rifle scope from the murder weapon with his fingerprints and testimonies from witnesses who attested to his bragging about the crime, left Beckwith in a precarious position. While he claimed that the murder weapon had been stolen from his house, his health problems and efforts to evade justice could not change the course of the trial. Beckwith's eventual conviction and life sentence marked a significant moment in the civil rights movement. His reactions to the verdict remain a subject of historical interest. Although the specifics of his immediate reactions are not widely documented, his attempts to evade justice and his previous boasting of the crime reveal a man who never fully acknowledged the gravity of his actions. In contrast, Merle Evers and those who had fought for justice for decades reacted with a mixture of relief and triumph. Her emotional statement, "All I want to say is, yay, Medgar, yay," captures the sense of vindication and closure that had eluded them for over 30 years. James Ford Seal. James Ford Seal, a former member of the Ku Klux Klan, was convicted of his involvement in the 1964 kidnapping and murder of Henry Hezekiah D. and Charles Eddie Moore, 2 African-American young men in Meadville, Mississippi. This case garnered significant attention due to its connection to racial violence and civil rights abuses. In May 1964, Seal, along with fellow Klansmen, abducted D. and Moore, both 19 years old, as they were hitchhiking near Roxie, Mississippi. They believed the 2 young men might be civil rights activists. Seal falsely identified himself as a federal revenue agent investigating moonshine stills, lured them into his car, and transported them into the Homoketo National Forest. At the forest, Seal held a sawed-off shotgun on the victims while others tied them to a tree and brutally beat them with long, skinny sticks. The Klansmen subsequently duct-taped their mouths and hands, loaded them into the trunk of a car, and drove approximately 100 miles to the Old River near Tallulah, Louisiana. There, they tied the victims to an engine block and sections of railroad track rails with chains before dumping them alive into the river. During his trial in 2007, James Ford Seal displayed little emotion and pleaded not guilty to the charges. His lawyer maintained his innocence, but he was ultimately convicted by a federal jury on counts of conspiracy to kidnap 2 persons and 2 counts of kidnapping. Seal's conviction and sentencing in 2007 drew reactions from various parties. The sisters of Henry D. and Charles Moore expressed their relief and a sense of justice finally being served. Thelma Collins, Henry D's sister, mentioned that she had no hatred in her heart, but was happy that justice was achieved. Thomas Moore, Charles Moore's brother, hoped that Seal would spend his time in prison reflecting on the heinous crime. Federal prosecutors and law enforcement authorities were satisfied that justice had been served. The U.S. Attorney's Office and FBI were involved in reopening the case and pursuing charges against Seal. They saw this as part of their commitment to re-examine and investigate civil rights-era murders. During the trial, Seal, wearing an orange jail jumpsuit interviewed and shackled, stood before the court but offered no words. His lack of a statement indicated no remorse or acknowledgement of his crimes. His actions throughout the legal process demonstrated his unwillingness to admit his involvement. The case garnered national attention, and the public, particularly those who had followed the civil rights movement, saw the conviction as a long overdue form of justice. Thomas Edwin Blandon Jr. and Amp Bobby Frank Cherry. The case of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, which killed 4 African-American girls and was a tragic symbol of racial hatred and violence, resulted in the conviction of Thomas Edwin Blandon Jr. and Bobby Frank Cherry. Thomas Edwin Blandon Jr., one of the conspirators responsible for the church bombing, received his life sentence in 2001. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 4 life terms. Blandon's reaction to his conviction was mixed. He maintained his innocence, as he had done for years, and continued to deny his involvement in the tragic event. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Blandon persisted in claiming that he was wrongly accused. He suggested that he had been falsely targeted and that the government had used fabricated evidence to convict him. His defiance was evident when he said, "I'm sorry it happened, deeply sorry, but I'm not responsible for it." As for the reaction of those close to Blandon, it was a complex mix of emotions. Some of his supporters stood by him, convinced of his innocence and portraying him as a victim of a biased justice system. They argued that he had been unfairly convicted based on flimsy evidence. However, many others, including the families of the victims and civil rights advocates, saw Blandon's conviction as a long overdue act of justice. They expressed relief that one of the culprits had finally been held accountable for the heinous crime after years of evading justice. Bobby Frank Cherry, another individual responsible for the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, faced a similar fate as Thomas Edwin Blandon Jr. He was also convicted in 2001 and received a life sentence for his role in the bombing. Cherry, however, displayed a different demeanor during his trial. He was observed smiling and appearing amused, even as the legal proceedings unfolded. He believed that the justice system that had protected him for decades would ultimately clear his name. Cherry, like Blandon, denied his involvement in the bombing and maintained his innocence. He also portrayed himself as a victim of a conspiracy, asserting that he had been unjustly targeted and was a political prisoner. His steadfast refusal to admit his guilt further deepened the pain and anger of the victims' families. As for the reactions of those close to Bobby Frank Cherry, opinions were divided. Some of his supporters continued to stand by him, asserting that he had been wrongly convicted. They questioned the credibility of the evidence presented during the trial. However, the families of the victims and civil rights activists believed that justice had finally been served. Henry Francis Hayes. Henry Francis Hayes, a former Ku Klux Klansman, found himself entangled in a gruesome and racially motivated crime that sent shockwaves throughout Alabama. The case revolved around the brutal lynching of Michael Donald, a 19-year-old black man who was senselessly murdered in 1981. As the facts of the case unfolded, Hayes' life took a dramatic turn, leading to profound reactions from him and those close to him. The crime that would ultimately define Henry Francis Hayes' life began when he and an accomplice, James Tiger Knowles, randomly targeted Michael Donald, a young black man walking home in Mobile, Alabama. They abducted Donald at gunpoint, subjected him to a vicious beating, and brutally strangled him with a rope. Their actions, fueled by racial hatred, led to the lynching of an innocent young man, leaving a community in shock. Hayes and Knowles' actions were not only cruel, but also motivated by a desire to send a message and terrorize the African-American community. Their audacity and brutality did not go unnoticed, as they burned a cross on the Mobile County Courthouse lawn to celebrate their heinous crime, further inflaming tensions. Following the murder, the reactions from those close to Hayes, including his family, would be mixed and marked by disbelief, guilt, and a stark contrast in ideologies. Hayes' family, especially his brother and sister, found themselves torn between their loyalty to Henry and the heinous crime he had committed. They appealed to Alabama Governor Fob James for clemency, insisting that Hayes had been manipulated into the Klan by their late father. Their pleas went unanswered. Hayes, who had become a member of the United Klans of America, UKA, faced an intense legal battle. The trial was contentious as the jury recommended life imprisonment for Hayes, but the judge overruled their verdict and sentenced him to death. This judicial decision was met with profound shock and anger from both sides. However, an unexpected turn of events would profoundly impact Hayes and his outlook on life. While on death row, Hayes developed an unlikely friendship with fellow inmate Anthony Ray Hinton, who was also sentenced to death for a crime he did not commit. Hinton's friendship and unwavering faith had a transformative effect on Hayes, leading him to question question his own beliefs and the hatred that had driven him to commit the gruesome murder. Hayes began reading the Bible and undergoing a remarkable transformation. He found solace in religion and discovered a new perspective on life and redemption. When Hayes was executed in Alabama's electric chair on June 6, 1997, the witnesses included Michael Donald's brother. Hayes's last words expressed the changes he had undergone. "Well, you know, Ray, I've been reading the Bible, and I have changed my views on so many things. I finally looked at you as a human being." The reactions to Henry Francis Hayes's journey from a KKK member to a man seeking redemption were met with a mixture of skepticism, hope, and relief. Some could not reconcile the heinous crime he had committed with his apparent transformation, while others saw it as a powerful testament to the potential for change and redemption, even in the darkest of circumstances. This was all about the KKK members and the reactions surrounding their convictions. Thank you for staying with us. If you enjoy our content, our newest videos are just a click away.